gamble with death. North Vietnamese gunners were quick to target the approaches and the landing zones. Anti-aircraft fire followed the helicopters in, and as soon as they landed, mortar crews and machine gunners opened up. As the slopes of the hills became a graveyard for American helicopters, the Marines realized that the survival of the hill outposts was under serious threat. And if they fell, the main base couldn't last for long. Air commanders worked frantically to devise new tactics for getting helicopters in and out of the hilltop bases safely. The tactics the Americans devised depended on swamping the enemy anti-aircraft guns and mortars around a landing zone with a high-speed assault. "12 Skyhawk fighter bombers, 4 Huey gunships, up to 16 supply helicopters, and an airborne command and control aircraft all acted together. The first stage was for 4 Skyhawks to hit North Vietnamese positions with bombs and napalm. 2 more laid tear gas. Next, 2 Skyhawks dropped smoke bombs to create a corridor, and 30 seconds later, the transport helicopters swooped in, covered by the Huey gunships. Meanwhile, 4 more Skyhawks with rockets, bombs, and guns made close-in attacks. The whole operation was over in less than 5 minutes. The new tactics quickly earned the title Super Gaggle because the helicopters looked like an oversized flock of geese. With the fighters and gunships in the air too, the method took incredible timing to pull off successfully. But it worked. Only 2 more helicopters would be shot down, supplying the hill outposts. By now, the strain of the long siege was beginning to tell on the troops at Khe Sanh. Being under shell fire every day meant a steady drain of casualties and constant tension. Food was often down to 2 C-ration meals daily. Conditions were appalling. The bunkers were knee-deep in filth and mud and overrun by rats. In addition, it was impossible to forget that up to 20,000 enemy soldiers were waiting for the signal to storm the base. To stop the men brooding about their possible fate, officers and NCOs kept the troops as busy as possible. Digging trenches, filling sandbags, and improving bunkers was a big part of every day. There was some patrolling too, although not more than 500 yards from friendly lines. Colonel Lowndes had no intention of sending his men into certain ambushes, and in any case, they had to be kept clear of the Niagara bombing raids. On the base perimeter, the watchword was constant vigilance. The North Vietnamese were probing the defenses with infantry and sapper teams. The Americans were facing assaults of up to 200 men at a time as the enemy tested for weaknesses in the line. The Marines were also plagued by hidden machine gun nests, which could open up at any moment, day or night. By now, the attention of the American public was riveted by the Battle of Khe Sanh. The story was being covered by dozens of journalists and was featured on network television every day. Stories about Khe Sanh accounted for 25% of all film news reports about the war on U.S. networks and up to 50% on CBS. Arguments raged over the rights and wrongs of trying to hold the base. In Washington, President Johnson was deeply worried about the fate of the Marines at Khe Sanh. He was constantly demanding the latest information on the battle. A model of the base had even been brought into the White House Situation Room. For the first time in the Vietnam War, the room was on full alert, 24 hours a day. A multitude of doubts and fears haunted the president and his advisors. Should nuclear weapons be used to save the base, as some had suggested? What if the enemy diverted or poisoned the base's water supply? Most worrying of all, what if enemy jets mounted a sudden bombing attack on Khe Sanh? It would be a massive propaganda victory for the North. Although North Vietnamese aircraft did penetrate to within striking distance of Khe Sanh, they made no attempt to attack the Marine base. American air defenses over the DMZ were far too strong. The biggest threat to the Marines at Khe Sanh did not come from modern fighter aircraft. It came from one of the most primitive weapons in warfare. The North Vietnamese besieging Khe Sanh were digging mile upon mile of trenches and bunkers, just as they had at Dien Bien Phu. They were fast approaching the perimeter of the combat base itself. Already there was a major system of North Vietnamese fortifications on Hill 471, less than 2 miles to the south of the Khe Sanh base. Now, at incredible speed, the trench lines were being extended northwards until they reached to within 25 yards of the American perimeter. Another line of trenches and bunkers was creeping across from the southeast. The NVA plan was for the infantry to mass under cover of the trenches before launching their final assault. By the last week of February 1968, few Americans inside Khe Sanh doubted that the big North Vietnamese ground assault would have to come soon. The moon was in its darkest phase, and a night infantry attack would have a good chance of overwhelming the perimeter defenses. Smashing the enemy trench lines was an absolute priority. The Americans tried every conceivable method to destroy the trenches. napalm and bombs were rained down in huge quantities. The Marines fired countless artillery barrages. But the Americans had little success. The discouraging fact, learned from other wars, was that it could take 1,000 hits to destroy 100 yards of trenches. In the end, the answer lay with the B-52s. Up to now, arc-light raids had been kept more than 2 miles away from the base perimeter. On February 27, 1968, the restriction was lifted. For the first time, the B-52s, under close radar guidance, dropped their bombs to within 1,200 yards of the Khe Sanh base. The effect was shattering. There was massive damage to the North Vietnamese trenches and bunkers. It was a turning point in the battle for Khe Sanh. From now on, close-in bombing by B-52s would play a major part in the defense. The sudden increase in North Vietnamese activity around Khe Sanh had left no one in any doubt that the climax of the battle was near. A few days before, a Marine patrol trying to get information had been almost wiped out. North Vietnamese traffic along Route 9 from Laos had also risen to a new peak. Enormous quantities of supplies were being rushed to the Khe Sanh divisions for the final assault. The 66th Regiment of the North Vietnamese 304th Division was assembling near a plantation to the south of the Khe Sanh base. Units were also massing near an old French fort. On the night of February 29th, a battalion of the 304th NVA Division assaulted the 37th Arvin Rangers at the eastern edge of the camp, a diversion to cover the unexpected and imminent withdrawal of all NLF troops from Khe Sanh. The American defense was to coordinate strikes by artillery, fighter bombers, and B-52s on 3 main areas through which the attacking NVA had to pass. Then, as the final assault waves approached the base, Khe Sanh's own defensive fire plan was unleashed. The base perimeter at the point of attack was manned by the 37th South Vietnamese Ranger Battalion. As the lead NVA units advanced, the base fired an artillery pattern forming the sides of an open box. A creeping barrage was then walked up and down inside. At the same time, 2 NVA battalions, cut off behind the box, were hit by fighter bomber strikes. While long-range artillery from the Rockpile and Camp Carroll created a moving outer cordon. The North Vietnamese troops, who survived to emerge from the open end of the box, then faced the direct fire of the South Vietnamese Rangers. Over the next week, despite continued aerial bombardment and the barrage of artillery fire, the trenches came even closer. Then, for no apparent reason, they stopped. On March 6th, with the Marines still waiting for the final assault, many of Jap's troops stumbled away through what was left of the jungle, an area of land that had received 100,000 tons of bombs, the heaviest aerial bombardment on a single piece of land in the history of warfare. The next 3 weeks were relatively quiet around Khe Sanh. American air activity increased steadily as the weather improved, and more NVA units began to withdraw into Laos. But the battle for Khe Sanh was not yet over. On March 22, 1968, there was a sudden explosion of violence. Without warning, a massive North Vietnamese bombardment, including huge numbers of heavy shells from the Ko Rock Mountain, slammed into Khe Sanh. More than 1,000 rounds hit the base at the rate of 100 every hour. At the same time, the electronic sensors around Khe Sanh again indicated NVA movements, and the Americans replied with heavy bombing. As the weather steadily improved, U.S. air attacks around the Khe Sanh base grew fiercer by the day. Further afield, over the North Vietnamese rear areas, fighter bombers roamed with orders to pounce on any movement. For the North Vietnamese, the situation could only get worse. General Giap was forced to concede that Khe Sanh could not now be taken. By this time, the Marines were mounting small but aggressive attacks out of the base. General Giap now ordered the remainder of his units to pull back from Khe Sanh. One by one, the NVA regiments around the base melted away. Only 6,000 troops were left behind to continue the siege of the Marine combat base. Although fighting would go on, the worst of Khe Sanh's ordeal was over. On April 1, 1968, the Americans formally ended Operation Scotland, the defense of Khe Sanh, and 7 days later began Operation Pegasus. April 9th was the first time in 45 days that no shells fell on Khe Sanh. The aim of Pegasus was to reopen Route 9, the road linking Khe Sanh to the other American bases along the demilitarized zone. As well as the Marines, Pegasus deployed the 1st Air Cavalry Division, the most mobile American unit in Vietnam. The Air Cavalry had more helicopters and airborne firepower than any other U.S. unit. It was perfectly suited to the rugged and demanding terrain near Khe Sanh. For Pegasus, the division's commander, Major General John Tolson, was also given the 1st Marine Regiment, a South Vietnamese airborne task force, and the 26th Marines in Khe Sanh. The entire length of Route 9 was still dominated by North Vietnamese Army units, especially elements of the 66th and 29th Regiments. For Operation Pegasus, the Americans built a main base for the air cavalry at Landing Zone Stud. The Marines would operate out of Ka Lu. The plan was for air assaults to seize landing zones and fire bases north and south of Route 9, while other forces pushed down the road. Although the weather was poor for fighter bombers, the weight of American firepower supporting Pegasus was still enormous. In a single day, the Americans fired more than 10,000 artillery rounds. Before the operation was over, B-52s launched 45 arc-light strikes. The American offensive was unstoppable. By April 5, 1968, the air cavalry had forged past Khe Sanh and established landing zones west and south of the combat base. While the cavalry consolidated their new positions, the Marines in Khe Sanh mounted their own breakout assaults. There was strong resistance from battalions of the North Vietnamese 66th Regiment, which mounted fierce counterattacks, but the Marines succeeded in taking Hill 471. It was the first of a string of NVA hills recaptured over the next few days. On April 8, 1968, the air cavalry and the 26th Marines at the combat base linked up, formally ending the siege of Khe Sanh. In fact, the Marines were less than pleased to be seen as being rescued by the Army. In their view, they had long since guaranteed their own survival. The 77-day siege of Khe Sanh had turned into the biggest single battle of the Vietnam War. The official assessment of the North Vietnamese Army dead was just over 1,600, with 2 divisions all but shattered. But thousands more were probably killed by bombs and left no trace of ever having existed. By the end of Operation Pegasus, American and South Vietnamese units had suffered 1,000 dead and 4,500 wounded. But official figures state that under 250 had been killed at the Khe Sanh combat base and its outposts. In the aftermath of the battle, General Westmoreland had high hopes that the next phase would be the thrust into Laos he had long advocated. He now had the forces he needed. But Westmoreland's hopes for a great campaign to follow up his victory at Khe Sanh were soon dashed. In the United States, by the spring of 1968, American public opinion had turned sharply against the war in Vietnam. The shock of the Tet Offensive had led many to believe that the U.S. would have to withdraw sooner or later. Under severe pressure, President Johnson had promised to search for a negotiated peace. He ruled out any big troop increases and any widening of the conflict. In June 1968, General Westmoreland approved the destruction of the Khe Sanh combat base. The president's decision not to widen the war had meant there could be no offensive into Laos. Nor was the base needed for defense, as there were now strong and highly mobile American forces in the area. In any case, as both sides were slowly beginning to realize, even as the battle had raged at Khe Sanh,